Well, my next guest has spent years working for human rights, including in Gaza. But last week, he quit his post at the United Nations in protest at what he called the unfolding genocide of the Palestinian people. Craig was director of the New York office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. You saw him earlier in Salma's report, Volker Turk. Well, we will discuss Craig's resignation in a moment. Before we do that, sir, on that trip to the Rafah crossing, your former boss, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, said both sides have committed war crimes. You also echoed calls for an immediate ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. More of the same from the head of the UN Agency for Human Rights, or a first step, at least by Volker Turk, towards a change in the agency's position? Your thoughts?
Well, I think it's an important step. I think he's right to call for the equal application of international law on all parties who are suspected of committing war crimes. What we have seen up until this point is a roar demanding accountability for war crimes potentially perpetrated by Hamas in their attack on October 7th. That is correct. Any member of Hamas who is implicated in war crimes, or anyone who commanded it, should be held accountable under the rule of law. But what we've heard at best up to this point is a whisper demanding accountability for Israeli war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and genocide before October 7th, and too much of a whisper for accountability for these crimes being committed by Israel since October 7th. Right. International human rights and humanitarian and international criminal law is very clear. It applies to all actors, and the duty of all member states of the UN and of the UN itself is to work for accountability for perpetrators and redress for victims, regardless of who is the perpetrator and who is the victim. And that was a part of my complaint to the UN, was I saw a sphere of trepidation where there was a hesitancy to do that with powerful states.
And I want to talk about that in a moment, because your resignation was widely reported. In part, your resignation letter said, this is a textbook case of genocide. The European ethno-nationalist settler colonial project in Palestine has entered its final phase towards the expedited destruction of the last remnants of indigenous Palestinian life in Palestine. That letter got a wide array of responses, some of which have praised your decision, others calling it overt anti-Semitism. Your response?
Yeah, we're well familiar with this tactic of charging people with anti-Semitism if they dare to call out Israeli violations against Palestinians. It is a tactic that is deployed and has been for a long time, and partially accounts for the trepidation that you see in international organizations. Nobody wants to be called an anti-Semite. But I made the case, and I continue to make the case, that criticism of Israeli human rights violations is not anti-Semitic any more than criticism of Saudi violations is Islamophobic, or criticism of Burmese violations is anti-Buddhist, or criticism of Indian violations is anti-Hindu. If all of those are true, there is no international human rights framework. But if it's only a prohibition on criticizing Israel, well, that's a racist proposition, because it means only Palestinians are not entitled to having their human rights defended. And I point to the many thousands all around the world of Jewish human rights defenders and peace activists and principled people who are standing up, demonstrating, marching, taking over Grand Central Station and the Statue of Liberty, making their voices heard on all continents, saying, this is not in their name. They do not support this. Israel does not represent them. And in fact, it's an old anti-Semitic trope to suggest that criticism of Israel is somehow a criticism of Jews. Israel is a state like all others. It's responsible for its own crimes, and that responsibility does not extend to our Jewish brothers and sisters anywhere.